Today, how leaders of El Paso's largest school district are trying to put the district's broken finances back together after a budget blow-up last month. The elected trustees overseeing El Paso Independent School District last week voted to enter financial exigency, a kind of bankruptcy for public school districts. What that will mean in practice, though, is layoffs for some EPISD employees. 2 trustees resigned from their roles after the vote last week. As the district picks up the pieces, a question looms. Who's responsible for the financial mismanagement? Some say the district's former chief financial officer and interim superintendent withheld bad news and covered up the financial blowup. Others say a lack of state funding was already challenging the district and removed any room for error. The district's new superintendent, Brian Lusk, has said the district will reorganize its business and finance department to rebuild public trust. A move that could prove important as the district prepares to put a bond election to voters later this year to raise funds for school repairs. But the budget blowup was a result of multiple years of oversight, according to EPISD's financial consultant. For me, as a graduate of EPISD schools and a resident and taxpayer in the district, questions have come to mind. Why didn't EPISD have internal controls in place that would have prevented this hidden budget crisis? How did the trustees that voters put in office allow this, a budget blowup that's going to mean some El Pasoans lose their livelihoods, to happen under their watch? And what will the district do to once again regain trust from El Pasoans? In a moment, I'll talk with El Paso Matters CEO Bob Moore and education reporter Claudia Silva about the situation at EPISD and what we should expect to see from the district going forward. First, this El Paso Matters podcast episode is brought to you by our podcast title sponsor, Tani Acosta and Chaparro, truck crash and injury attorneys. Their team of local, seasoned trial attorneys are ready to help if you've been injured in a crash. And you can read our free reporting or sign up for our newsletter at elpasomatters.org. On to our conversation. Claudia, Bob, appreciate you both joining me.
Thanks for having us.
Can you guys just bring us up to speed on what's happened with EPISD's finances over the last month and just kind of this whole situation that's playing out there?
I'll let Claudia take the first stab at that. That's an extensive answer.
Yeah, well, I'll try to make it short, but I think a lot of this information started to come to light for the district early last month and then publicly a little bit more towards the end of the month. But essentially, if you want to kind of a quick overview, the district learned that they were going to have a deficit that was larger than they initially expected in early May. And a few days after they discovered this, the CFO, Martha Aguirre, resigned. Notably, she used to be the interim superintendent after the previous one, Diana Saavedra, resigned under pressure from a newly elected board, and before Brian Lusk took over as superintendent earlier this year. So after some auditors and an independent company came in to take a look at everything, they discovered that the deficit was much larger than they initially expected. So last year, they had adopted a budget with a $6 million deficit. That ended up going up to $52 million, and we were going to be expecting a $42 million deficit for the following year. So in the end, the district needs to cut costs and begin making plans to eliminate 400 positions. Now, since then, the board did vote to declare financial exigency and also said that they were going to lay off about 90 employees. Isn't that right, Bob?
That's the current number, but it's squishy still.
Okay. And so that's kind of where we are today.
The one thing I want to point out, too, on the deficits, because people who follow national government here talks about the deficits, and when Congress deficit spends, it means they borrow money. That's not the same situation here. The school districts cannot borrow money, or at least long-term money, to fund day-to-day operations. So when Claudia says deficit, it means they're taking it out of their savings account. A year ago, when Claudia was covering school board budget meetings, EPISD was bragging that they had the largest fund balance, meaning reserves, of any of the major school districts in the county. They're not saying that anymore. And so just this year alone probably eroded 40% or more of their savings.
appreciate that kind of summary on where we're at. Can you guys just talk more about what financial exigency means for EPISD? Like what are the implications of that? And then also, you mentioned around 90 layoffs, Bob. I think before they were talking maybe 400 or even more. And so kind of what does financial exigency mean, and what was behind that reduction in the number of expected layoffs?
So I think Claudia and I have kind of gotten a law degree in school finance law the last few weeks, but basically financial exigency says we can't pay our bills under normal course of operations. We're in bad shape, so we have to have some emergency powers that we normally wouldn't have. And the most significant of those is the power for the superintendent as the chief executive of the district to break contracts that normally they couldn't break. And most importantly, those involve employment contracts with teachers, with administrators, with everybody who works in the district. And that's a great power to have. Great in the sense of immense. And the important context of this, I think Claudia's research showed that prior to EPISD, only 18 of the 1,200 school districts in Texas had filed for financial exigency in the last decade. This is a very rare and very dramatic step. We've compared it to bankruptcy in the private sector, which is not a one-to-one explanation, but much like bankruptcy, it empowers the organization in financial difficulties to break contracts. And so that's what the board voted on in one vote this past week, and then they made a second vote to approve one of two options that they had on a reduction in force. The numbers, as you indicated, were much lower for both of those options than the previous numbers. That's because they've had vacant positions that haven't been filled. They've had people announcing they're going to retire, so they don't have to force people out. But it's still kind of a moving number, and 92 is sort of where we left it on Thursday night. But the big number for people to remember is probably 600 or more. That's the number of decrease in employees that EPISD is going to have this coming school year versus where they began the last school year, which is 8 to 9% of the total payroll of the district. We have never seen cuts like this at any public entity in El Paso that I'm aware of. And obviously, as you can see through the gray hairs, I've been doing this for a little while. It is a massive, massive step, and it's not an exaggeration to call it unprecedented for El Paso.
Yeah, and one thing that I did want to note related to financial exigency is that we have heard before that the situation, or at least the tough financial situation, is not completely unique to EPISD. What is unique is how extreme it is, and that something needs to be done, and that they needed to declare this in order to correct the issue. But there are plenty of other districts in Texas right now who are facing tough financial situations. And one of the things I think is that there's been limited funding increases over several years. I think there was the funding increase that happened last year, and then prior to that, there hadn't been any increases since 2019. So Texas is also pretty close to the bottom when it comes to per student funding when you compare to other states. So because Texas schools haven't gotten a lot of funding increases, if there are any mistakes, it just leaves little to no room for error. And I think that's one of the things that happened here at EPISD is if there was some additional funding that they were expected to get. I know there was a hold harmless promise when the state legislature gave homestead exemptions and it basically increased tax breaks for homeowners. They promised that they were going to give the districts a certain amount of money that ended up not coming through after the comptroller made some recalculations.
And so this is one of the challenges in explaining the situation is that school finance law in Texas is so complex and there's so many moving parts. But I think Claudia's touching on something very important here, and that is that the state has made a number of policy decisions over the years that have been meant to withhold or redirect funding that had gone to public schools. And lots of room to debate whether those were good ideas or bad ideas. But that's the reason you see so many school districts who had to adopt a deficit budget last year, who are facing extreme deficits this year. The uniqueness with EPISD, and the reason they're declaring financial exigency and the others are not, is EPISD has some horrific self-inflicted wounds here. And we'll talk more about that too, and what exactly happened. So it made the situation worse. So there's a lot of moving parts to all of this. The other big thing that we can't get away from, and this is also a reason other districts are struggling, is this issue of declining enrollment. And we've talked about this repeatedly over these podcasts, and then El Paso Matters has reported on it. One unique thing that's now in play is that for the first time outside the pandemic year, Texas saw an overall decline in student enrollment this year. Statewide, there are about 75,000 fewer students in public schools, which means traditional school districts and charter schools, which has everybody freaked out. For context, I want to point out that El Paso County accounts for about 3% of all the kids enrolled in public schools in Texas. El Paso County accounts for 6% of the enrollment decline in Texas. And we've also been at it a lot longer than the rest of the state. So even though we've been shedding students for a number of years, we're still shedding them at a much faster rate than the state. And because funding tends to follow enrollment and attendance, that is the big issue that's underlying all of this too.
I appreciate you guys, kind of that explanation of the role of the state policies, right, and just the acknowledgement that El Paso is not the only city with public school districts that are enduring some financial challenges. I wonder if you guys, but you referred kind of to some of the internal situations at EPISD that have also contributed to their challenges, Bob. I wonder can you guys just talk through this debate about the school closures, right? And this idea that, hey, enrollment's declining at El Paso, we got to close some schools. That's going to be the big, financial savior, right? Is closing down some of these operations, realizing savings, and then, we kind of make the district leaner and more efficient, right? But at the same time, the district did close some schools last year, and the district didn't realize the savings it expected. So I just wonder if you can talk about this dynamic of some people saying, hey, look, declining enrollment, close schools, that'll save everything, but then the district's experience hasn't reflected that. And that's kind of been a debate, I think, about how EPISD got in this financial position, right? So just kind of, can you guys just talk about that debate and sort of, what's played out there?
Claudia lived through this last year, so I'll let her kind of outline what happened.
Yeah. So I think one important thing to really mention when you talk about school closures is, when you are dealing with declining enrollment, that is the primary way to address it is by closing schools. And actually over the week I went to an Education Writers Association conference, and there was a big discussion because this is happening nationally where enrollment is declining. And really, there are just too many schools in this country for the number of children. And this is, affecting our community. So when you talk about school closures, though, just closing a school doesn't necessarily save a whole lot of money. A lot of the big savings that you see right away are going to be in utilities and maybe reduce some of the cost of maintenance. But those employees and their salaries don't suddenly disappear just because you close a school. So usually this is a long-term strategy that a district will take, is they close a school, and over time, as people retire, then they slowly start reducing the number of overall positions. And I really think that that's what EPISD's plan was when they wanted to close schools. They promised all the teachers that they were still going to have a job. All those teachers got redistributed to campuses across the district. And, so essentially their payroll costs didn't change whatsoever.
It actually did. It went up.
That's something we were going to get to.
Another error, yeah.
Right. I guess they weren't supposed to change. Their payroll costs weren't supposed to change. But in actuality, what ended up happening is the district ended up hiring more employees, and that actually did cause their payroll costs to go up. So it sounds like to me that they didn't actually follow through with what their initial plan was supposed to be, which was to reduce the number of employees. When you look at the employees, so I went ahead and I looked at the state data, and something to remember with state data is that it counts full-time equivalency. So it's just kind of adds up essentially how many it adds up essentially the hours to how many.
It's the total workforce divided by 40 hours, which is as a long-time bean counter I can relate to. So just when Claudia mentions the FTE numbers, the actual number of human beings involved in this is more than that number. So that's important to remember.
Right. This is the first year that they've actually started counting actual employee numbers. But when we look at the FTE numbers, those went from 7,100 to 7,200 from the previous school year to this one. So that does show that they, knew that they were going to be paying more in payroll, even though the plan was to pay less.
And it's also important to note that in the budget plan for last year, the school board or the school district was planning on a 2.1% decline in enrollment. So kind of a questionable decision to begin with. When your enrollment is going down by 2.1%, why are you holding payroll steady? But what happened, and this is one of the errors we can talk about, and error may not be the right word, the actual result of enrollment was that enrollment declined by 4%. The district never adjusted to that. And instead wound up adding employees. So you wind up spending more money, having more employees, and far fewer students, and hence you have a massive financial problem.
And that was also one of the big debates on the board last year, right? Was sort of all about the school closures. Is this the right path for the district and so forth? So it's just interesting that that's now kind of resurfaced, and it turns out it wasn't the financial savior that I think the board thought it would be.
It was oversold, and Claudia has been the one kind of consistent voice in all of this. That it really was a long-term savings plan. It was not an immediate panacea, but I think it kind of got spun up as like this will help us avoid other hard choices, but it didn't happen. And I think it's an example going forward that we have to keep in mind that the implementation and consequences of school closures is far more complex than a lot of people assume.
Yeah.